Good morning. You're watching Businessworld Live. I'm Danie Laurel. It's the start of a new trading week. Let's kick off with our banner story. The Competition Commission is flagging the high cost of medicines in the country. That's an issue that has been made more urgent by the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. PCC Chairman Arsenio Balicasan says there needs to be an assessment on why drug prices in the country are much higher than that of Thailand and other developing countries. Now, in a policy note last year, the competition watchdog said small pharmaceutical firms are struggling to compete in a domestic market dominated by multinational companies. In fact, the PCC says the top 20 pharmaceutical firms in the country account for a whopping 73% of the market. The Commission says they are already looking at some verified complaints, which can be used to trigger a probe against the pharma companies who might be acting against the public's interest. Now, the Bangko Sentral is expected to maintain an accommodative policy to support the economy's recovery. The BSP says the loose monetary policy will remain in place, noting that the spike in inflation is just temporary. Monetary Board member Felipe Medalla says that by next year, inflation will be very close to 3%, and that is the reason why policy will remain accommodative despite the fact that current inflation is above 4%. The Monetary Board will meet on June 24th. The record low 2% key policy rate was unchanged during its last May 13 meeting. Recall that inflation rose by 4.5% for the third straight month in May, exceeding the Bangko Central's annual target of 2 to 4%. The Bangko Central expects inflation to settle at 3.9% for the full year 2021 and 2.8% for 2022. The uptick in inflation in recent months was caused by supply issues on pork due to the ASF outbreak. The economy is also facing challenges from renewed lockdowns and slow vaccination rollouts. Meanwhile, the national government paid nearly 64.3 billion pesos in debt in April. The Treasury says this was 57% lower year on year as the principal repayments dropped. Okay, guys, opening the Monday report with a very quick roundup of global equities. You can see that on my terminal here. First, with the U.S. Nasdaq up by 0.3%, the S&P 500 up by 0.2% on Friday. Now, this ahead of the Group 7 or the G7 having their meeting on Sunday, and they seem to have fallen short on that expected pledge that they would be donating 1 billion additional vaccines or vaccine doses rather to the developing nations. Now, U.S. President Joe Biden said the U.S. may be able to provide 1 billion more doses to the world, but that is by 2023 pa. Now, another thing we're looking at is UK Prime Minister, of course, Boris Johnson, saying he's now less hopeful about lifting England's restrictions, which was planned to be on June 21st. So a lot of setbacks still happening here. Now, over in Asia, China will be in focus. There will be activity data coming out there. Underlying recoveries, however, in demand and supply should remain on track. Bank of Japan is also set to keep policy settings unchanged. They will be reporting their data, consumer prices or CPI, machine orders and trade this week. Now, on the home front, let's take a look at our open, sliding a touch. That is down by 0.4%. We are below the 6,900 levels we broke through last week. And investors, according to analysts, will be watching out for the decision of the government. What's going to happen after June 15 in terms of quarantine measures, and also, of course, the progress in the vaccination program. Meanwhile, RCBC's Mike Ricafort said there has been an increase in net foreign buying in the past 2 weeks. And you can see that on my terminal here. Net foreign buying slowly returning. The foreign investors are still, however, a bit hesitant. The numbers are still down when you compare it to last year. Even when we went on the biggest lockdown in 2020, foreign buying was down 15.14% year on year. Now, that translates to a net foreign selling actually of 67.52 billion pesos year to date so far. That's according to the PSE. And finally, just a quick check on our movers this morning. I'm going to pull out the one-day chart for you, 4 minutes into trade. LTG leading the chart. It's up by 1 close to 2% really, together with RRHI. But on the losing end, you've got SM Investments dragging the index by 2%. And finally, just a quick check on the airlines. This, as we've gotten some reports from Cirium, that PAL, according to Cirium, that PAL's Chapter 11 filing might be pushing through this month. That is, of course, going to be in the US. That did not happen on the month of May. They were hoping for that, but Cirium, in an analysis posted in Flight Global, said that all of PAL's lessors are now at the documentation stage, with many having formed informal working groups, and they're now working with law firms. According to their sources, they said that PAL is eyeing to raise debtor-in-possession financing of $505 million plus exit financing of about $150 million. The power outage saga is far from over, with finger pointing on who is to blame. And now the NGCP says consumers must brace themselves for a possible spike in power rates if the DOE is to be followed. Here to explain their side of the story, we have with us Cynthia Alabanza. She's spokesperson of the National Grid Corporation of the Philippines. Welcome back, Attorney Cynthia.
Yeah, good morning, Danie.
Attorney, what is going on? There is a blame game right now. The DOE is saying that you did not comply with the so-called 4% reserves, basically saying that you are the cause for the brownouts or outages and the red alert that we have seen in the recent weeks. Why would, explain your side here, why would you not have complied with this mandatory requirement? Why is this issue only coming up right now?
Yeah, unfortunately, there's a lot of confusion going on, and it's such a technical issue that it's very difficult for an ordinary person to understand. But really, the bottom line here, NGCP is the transmission service provider. We only provide the service of providing the towers and the cables to transmit electricity from the suppliers to the distributors or the distribution utilities. While we do have an obligation to procure what we call ancillary services, or what most people call reserves, these are simply not the same kind of reserves that people tend to think as a backup if you lose electricity. These ancillary services really are meant just to balance the grid and are not for sale to the consumers. So our firm position is that the issue on the power supply here is really a shortage, and it's not a transmission issue. So it cannot be NGCP's obligation to provide the kind of power to replace the ones that was lost. Because under the law, we are not allowed to buy and sell electricity to consumers. So this is something that, we try to explain, but it's very difficult for the layperson to understand because it's really very technical in nature.
But this has been something that should be, according to the DOE, legally binding. Why was it not discussed earlier, before all of these outages, that you could not provide the so-called reserves that the consumer expects you to do? And why was it not flagged that this might be the case, that there might actually be power outages, given that you're not able to meet this 4% requirement?
Actually, something that I also want to point out is, apart from the fact that NGCP should not be made responsible for supply issues, is that what the DOE is asking us to do is not to procure additional supply, but only to change the nature of our purchasing from what we're doing now, which is a non-firm arrangement, or pay only when needed and dispatched, to a firm arrangement, which is akin to a take or pay, which means that even if it is not used, it will be paid for. And this is actually the basis of NGCP's warning for the impending power hike if we are compelled to procure all our ancillary services on a take or pay basis.
What is the position of the ERC? Because they're supposed to be the ones enforcing such contracts, or the go-between this requirement and what you're capable of providing. And are they aware of the percentages, or the mixture of firm and non-firm agreements that you have ended up with, and how you calculated this?
Well, that's the strange thing about this whole arrangement, right? So when we are supposed to do the firm, it will not add to the power supply. In fact, the firm arrangements are there and the non-firm arrangements are there, and taken together, we do have enough of these ancillary services. So changing the nature of the contract will not alleviate the impending power shortage. And the ERC at last week's Senate hearings, they did also have preliminary simulations, and they also show a possible rise similar in prices, similar to what NGCP has simulated. Now, that's exactly what we're saying, that based on our internal simulations, there could be a possible rise in a steep rise in electricity rates. And we're only asking for some prudence in the implementation of this policy, and to give the ERC an opportunity to really thoroughly study the impact on the consumers before such a drastic change in the procurement policies are implemented, which in essence will not alleviate the situation. It will just cause a rise in prices, but will not add anything to the current supply situation.
Okay, ma'am, before we go to the consumer side, just to clarify here, had you complied with this supposed 4% ancillary firm contracts, would this power issue not have, or outages not have happened, or would they still have happened?
They would still have happened, except that you'll be paying for more. The
Okay.
consumer will be paying for more. And the impact is, I think, enough that it should be looked into. It's not minimal, it's substantive. The impact will be substantive.
Okay, let's talk about the consumer side here. Not just an increase, but you've said, or at least your director has said, astronomical
Yes.
spike in prices. What is the alternative? Do we just live with brownouts? Our rates are exceedingly high. What's the short-term solution, if anything?
That's the whole thing. No? The alternative here really is not found in the transmission part of the supply chain. What you really need to do is boost supply at the generator side. Because NGCP just uses this to balance voltage and frequency. It's not meant to augment supply. So if you have a power shortage, then clearly, logically, the common sense solution would be to engage more supply. It doesn't make sense to improve the transmission grid if there's nothing wrong with it, if that's the one, if that isn't the sector that's causing the outage. You go to the root cause, which is supply, and that's where you try and improve policy. If you're saying that there are problems engaging more investors, then you improve the market and make it more attractive to new investors so that you will improve the supply situation. Don't put it in a take or pay situation in a sector that does not need it.
Okay, so medyo matagal pa yan if that is the only solution here for new power plants to come online. Let's talk about the ERC probe on the outages. I know that the NGCP that's not in your jurisdiction to probe these outages, but nevertheless, in your understanding, do you think there might have been collusion? And if so, what would be the possible rationale for collusion, for everybody to just shut down power plants without technical reason altogether?
Yeah, before we go into the ERC, I'd just like to mention that yes, this is going to be a long-term solution if you add power plants, which is why it's very important as the policy-making body for the DOE really to plan forward. We do have 5-year, 10 years plans. So what we're consuming today should have been planned 5 years ago because consumption continually goes up. So the influx of investors into the supply market should be constant and should always keep pace, or at the very least, and or even outpace the increase in demand. So that's exactly how delicate the balance of supply and demand for electricity is. As regards collusion, it's very difficult for NGCP to say whether there was collusion or not. All we can really give you is the information. And on those days that where we suffered power interruptions, we noted, based on the DOE's data itself, that there was a loss of 4,000 megawatts to the grid. That's equivalent to 40% of your 30 or 40% of your total requirement for that day. Now, out of that 4,000 megawatts, only around 300 megawatts was planned. The rest was unplanned and unscheduled, which is why everyone was taken aback and was surprised that this happened, because these were unplanned and unscheduled and nobody really foresaw that it was coming. So those are the facts that as NGCP monitored it.
Okay, and finally, ma'am, with your discussions on with the power generators, what can you assure consumers at this point in time while this debate on that firm contracts continues with the DOE?
Well, NGCP really just manages the smooth flow of electricity. And part of that is coordinating with all the generators to ensure that they don't do their maintenance shutdowns all at the same time to precisely prevent this kind of situation. So we are constantly coordinating with the generators and monitoring their commitments on when they can return to the grid so that the supply will be stabilized. But we do see a thinning of supplies again at the end of the month and possibly at the end of July and the beginning of August. But the closer we come to these periods, the projections will be a little more accurate. So we have to wait and see and see where the supply situation takes us, and of course the demand situation, whether the opening up of the economy will have an effect on this. Because when we loosen the quarantine restrictions, we do see an upsurge in the consumption of electricity. So that might also play a major role in the supply situation in the coming months.
Ma'am, sorry, last question before we let you go. The base case scenario, as you mentioned, is to expect more of these thinning supply problems. What is the worst case scenario for consumers? By how much might their electricity bills actually go up if this memorandum or agreement is enforced by the DOE?
Well, based on our preliminary projections, and this is just NGCP's internal computation based on the offers we've had for firm contracts and the kind of power plants and fuel that they run on, which is mostly diesel, we are seeing an increase. If you're a consumer using around 200 kilowatt hours and you're from Luzon, we're seeing 128 pesos additional charges per month. If you're from Visayas, the increase on your monthly bill will be 108 pesos. For Mindanao, it's even bigger. If you're a consumer using 200 kilowatt hours per month, you can see as much as 278 pesos in additional charges on your monthly bill.
Okay, so all of these additional charges without a resolution for the time being in terms of the thinning electricity supply. Thank you so much for that update, Attorney Cynthia Alabanza, spokesperson of the NGCP.
Thank you, Danie, and good morning.
Here are other headlines we're keeping our eyes on. Business groups are asking Congress to protect the proprietary information of businesses in the proposed Freedom of Information bills. Groups like the Makati Business Club and the Management Association of the Philippines said FOI bills should only cover documents from private firms that transact with government agencies and public funds. They said proprietary information related to patents, formulation, intellectual property, and the like should be excluded, as the disclosure of such information could negatively affect commercial and business interests. This statement was signed by a total of 20 groups, including various foreign chambers like the American and European Chambers of Commerce in the Philippines. The House of Representatives is currently deliberating on 19 bills that aim to allow citizens to request information about government transactions and operations. The BIR has issued rules over the weekend on setting 12% VAT on export sales of companies as authorized by the trade law. Transactions covered under the new rules are export sales of raw materials and packaging items to a foreign buyer that will be delivered to a resident export enterprise for manufacturing in the country. Raw materials and packaging items sold to companies which derive 70% of total sales from exports will also pay the 12% VAT. Same goes with export sales covered by the Omnibus Investment Code of 1987 and outsourced services of goods to be exported. Recall that RA 10963, or the trade law, took effect in 2018, which cut the personal income tax while increasing the rates on some goods and services. And that's our first look into the business day. Today is June 14, 2021. Catch Businessworld live for the market close. That's at 3:15 p.m. today. I'm Danie Laurel. Mask on, wash hands, stay safe, Philippines. We are One News.